Hey guys, we are going to look in this video at factoring when your leading coefficient is a negative number. Okay, so when we have a problem like negative x squared plus 4x plus 5. Okay, just a little bit so you can see it. Okay, so negative x squared, right? We can see that our leading coefficient here this time is a negative 1 instead of a positive 1. All right, so the way that we work this one is going to have to be a little bit different than the way that we worked either of the positive cases. Okay, so I went ahead and just filled in my negative 1 right here, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take that negative 1 and we are going to factor it out of every other term, right? Everything is divisible by negative 1. So I'm going to bring down my negative 1. Okay. I'm going to open up a set of parentheses. And then I'm just going to take each term and divide it by negative 1 and put whatever's left inside of my parentheses here. So negative 1x squared divided by negative 1 just leaves me with x squared. Okay. 4x divided by negative 1 makes it a negative 4x. And then 5 divided by negative 1 makes it negative 5. All right? So we have factored a negative 1 out of every term. Okay. From here, we are going to factor what's inside our parentheses. Now notice this time we have a leading coefficient of positive 1, right? We have a positive x squared. When I'm factoring this, I'm going to use my x method. So I have our negative 5, right? We need two numbers that multiply to make negative 5. And we also have the negative 4, goes on the bottom here, looking for two numbers that are going to add to make negative 4. Okay, so to get a negative 5, right? If I make a list of numbers that multiply to make negative 5, there's 1 times 5. And either the 1 is negative or the 5 is negative. So I'm going to put negative 1 and positive 5, but then we could also do positive 1 and negative 5. Okay, so I'm looking for the pair that will multiply to make negative 5 and add to make negative 4. Well, if I want to add to make a negative 4, we need to use the 1 and the negative 5. So I have 1 and negative 5 in our x. Okay, so then that means that this, right, is going to factor into x plus 1 times x minus 5. And remember, we still have our negative 1 that we factored out at the very beginning. Okay, so this would be our answer. Now, we can still check, okay? If we check our answer real quick, we can FOIL. First, oh, I keep grabbing this one and it just doesn't work. Okay, so we can FOIL first times the first, outside times the outside, inside times the inside, and last times the last. We still have that negative 1 out in front. So let's go ahead and combine our like terms inside of parentheses, and then we can distribute the negative 1. When I combine my like terms right here, I get a negative 4x. Okay, and then we would just distribute the negative 1 through the parentheses. Negative 1 times x squared gives me a negative x squared. Negative 1 times negative 4x is positive 4x. And negative 1 times negative 5 is positive 5. Okay, since this matches what we started with, we know that we had the correct answer. All right, we're going to look at another one where we have a negative leading coefficient. This time, let's do a negative 3 for our leading coefficient. Okay, so we are going to look at negative 3. Oh, can y'all see that? Here, I'm going to move this down some. Negative 3x squared plus 17x minus 20. All right, so if we're going to factor this expression, the first thing I want to check is, can I factor out a -3, right? Can I divide everything by a -3 the same way we divided by a -1 on the last problem? And we kind of run into an issue with that because 17 is not divisible by 3 and neither is 20. So since we can't factor out the -3, we're going to have to just factor out the negative. So if I know that -3 is really -3 times 1 or -1 times 3, right? If I know these are factors that multiply to give me -3, I can go ahead and factor out the -1, okay? So it's almost like I am just taking this -3 right here and I am rewriting it as -1 times 3x squared. And then we're going to divide every term by that -1. Okay, so I have -1. When I divide this by -1, now I have 3x squared. If I do a positive 17x divided by -1, I get a -17x. And then the -20 divided by -1 gives me a positive 20. All right, now just like last time, this is what I'm going to work on factoring. Okay, so I'm almost just ignoring the -1 for right now. And then when I get done factoring, I'll just make sure that I bring him back in at the end. All right, so we are going to, since we have a leading coefficient here of 3, we're going to use the X box method. So I'm going to set up the X, right? Remember, since we have a leading coefficient of 3, we are going to multiply 3 times 20 to get 60, right? And we're looking for two numbers that multiply to make 60. And add to make a -17. Or subtract to make 17. All right, so I'm going to make a list of my multiples of 60. This is kind of a long list. There's 1 and 60, 2 and 30, 3 and 20, 4 and 15, 5 and 12, 6 and 10, 7, 8, 9, and then we're back at 10. Okay, so these are my options of numbers that will multiply to give me 60. All right, so if I'm multiplying to get 60 and adding to get a -17, I need to look at my options. Well, the first one that I see that can combine to give me a -17 is the 3 and the 20, right? So the 3 and the 20 can make a -17 if the 3 is positive and the 20 is negative, right? -20, positive 3, that adds to make a -17. But the problem is, if I try to do 3 and -20, well, 3 times -20 makes -60 and not positive 60. So these two numbers will add to make a -17, but they do not multiply to make a -60. So we don't want to use the 3 and the 20. I'm going to come back to my list of factors, okay? And when I keep going a little bit further down the list, I can see the 5 and the 12. Well, 5 and 12 add to make a -17 if both the 5 and the 12 are negative. So let's try -5 and -12, right? Those will add to make a -17. If I do a -5 times a -12, right, two negatives do become a positive. All right, so sometimes you have to be careful when you're picking out your factors. Make sure that it fits both requirements. It multiplies to give you this number, and it also adds to give you this number. Okay, so we're going to use the -5 and the -12. Now, since this one had that leading coefficient, right, we do need to use the box. So I'm going to set up a 2 by 2 box here. All right, so I'm going to take the first term, the 3x squared, and put that in the first box. I'm going to take the last term, the positive 20, and put it in the last box. And then my two numbers from the x are going to go in with an x behind them. So I had a -5x, and I had a -12x. All right, then remember we factor out the greatest common factor for each row and each column. So if I factor for the first row here, both boxes have an x, and then 3 and 5 only have a common factor of 1, right? So we brought out 1x. In the bottom row, 12 and 20 have a common factor of 4. And since this is a negative 12, we're going to make this a negative 4, right? If it's touching a negative, we make it a negative. For the first column, we can factor out an x. We can also factor out a 3. And then for the second column, the only thing that we can factor out is a 5. And since it's touching this negative 5, we're going to make it a negative 5. So what's inside of the parentheses here factors into 3x minus 5 times x minus 4. But don't forget, we still had that negative 1 hanging on at the front, and so we need to make sure we include him in our answer. Okay. All right, now just like the other one, we could check our answer, make sure that we had it correct. If you guys have any questions, please reach out to me and let me know. When you have a negative coefficient, right, we just factor a negative 1 out of everything and then factor what's left like normal. Just don't forget to bring your negative 1 down and put it in front of your factors when you're finished.